My grave apologies, you guys. Family emergency. I am so sorry. Something came up with my son. So sorry. Okay, so we are doing test number 2 this week. Again, also for waiting so long, I am I'm going to give you more than 5 points. That's the very least I can do. Thank you so much. All right, so let's see here. This is so we're doing test 2 this week. All right. Thank you. I appreciate your concern. Um, let's see here. So Karen Nichols. Let me get the names down. I am so sorry. All right. So great. So I hope you're doing okay, that you're doing well in your personal lives and your health as well. Um, and so at any rate, let's see here. There's Andrea Muniz. Um, let's see. Make sure that I have all the names. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Cisneros, Arena. So the topics we are doing go from the War for Independence, then the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation that we tried briefly as technically our first government, and then to our current republic, early republic, great man history of the first 3 administrations, as well as the let's see here, as well as the pardon you guys. Yeah, I am so sorry. Let's get this. Let's get this down. Open up. Okay. Going back to the meeting here. Let's share that. Let's see where it is opened. Pardon me. Let me close that out. Let me try it again. Should be test 2. Here we go. All right. Again, so sorry. All right. So notice numbers 1. Well, actually, not 1. Let's see. 2, 3. Right. And number 8 all refer to the different theses, the different arguments or interpretations to the War for Independence, right? So 2, right? Historians who interpret the American War for Independence from Great Britain as a fight to maintain political powers and economic rights that the colonists had already accumulated due to poor enforcement of English mercantilist laws and the patronage system. That would be the salutary neglect thesis, right? A term taken from Edmund Burke and some of the Whigs back in England, contending that we had been left alone, we had been neglected, but it had a healthy or salutary effect on our colonies, right? That mercantilist restrictions on trade, on taxation, the colonial councils and governors did not really throw their weight around, and the colonial assemblies were able to accrue a lot of powers. So that's number 1 on the handout. Almost all the questions, you guys, come straight from the argumentative assignments. Okay. And so you have the salutary neglect thesis, which was number 1 on the handout, applies to number 2 here. Number 3, remember Bernard Bailyn's thesis. The book was called The Ideological Origins of the Revolution. So he believes subjectively that we had a revolution, a 180-degree turn politically, economically, and socially. And he believes that it was fundamentally predicated on ideas, the French and Scottish Enlightenment, the Great Awakening, etc. So you may want to take a good look at option B for number 3, okay? Regarding the Enlightenment, we mentioned the social contract, natural rights, checks and balances, right? as far as number 4 goes. With number 5, the Great Awakening, with Bernard Bailyn's thesis, was that deference, right? Knowing your place and obeying your authoritative figures ought to be conditional. That if they themselves are not obeying God's laws, then you are not bound to defer to them and obey them. So it was kind of, it created the groundwork, the Great Awakening for civil disobedience, right? In good conscience before your Christian God, disobeying what you believe to be ungodly, immoral leadership. All right. Remember with the Scottish and English libertarians and the Scottish Enlightenment, it was largely libertarian, right? With the Whig Party, they wanted to make sure that there were constitutional rights guaranteed to the people, checks and balances that will restrain the leadership from having arbitrary power, right, over the people. And then number 8, Howard Zinn's thesis was a very cynical thesis. It was number 4 of your handout, right? And remember that was the idea that with in conflict history fashion, that there are separate demographics, right, or classes. And by the way, I'm writing extra points, you guys, before I forget. Thank you so much for waiting. Um, but that there was a particular demographic of an elite uh, cabal of American colonials that were kind of in limbo, right? They were very regularly successful in their business ventures, but not to the same extent under the patronage system as their British counterparts, and that they were regularly elected into the colonial assemblies, but not selected into the royal councils or couldn't serve as governors in most of the states or colonies, etc. And that in that limbo position, they felt perhaps a little bit frightened of a class war in the time of the Stamp Act mobs, violence, the grassroots organization like the Sons of Liberty chapters, that they decided to hijack this rebellion from the poor and create a convenient scapegoat in the British to get them out, right, of the picture so that they could be the top dog standing, and to utilize the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, etc., right, as propaganda, as a means of trying, as a carrot, if you will, to get the regular American people to fight with and for them in the Continental Army and the colonial militias. All right, so very cynical thesis with number 8. Number 7 refers to number 3 in the handout, right? So I made the argument that what I intended to convey on number 3 was Joseph Ellis was mildly revisionist, and that he clearly showed evidence of a very self-interested, selfishly ambitious George Washington, whose ambition oftentimes was thwarted to his own chagrin and frustration. However, that evidence that Washington felt not just for himself, right, but that for the entire population of the colonies, that this was unfair, that this was an inherently illogical, this patronage system of getting opportunities by bloodline and by connection rather than by merit and by talent and by hard work, etc. All right, so number 3 is pertinent. Number 3 of the handout is pertinent to number 7 on your test 2. And remember, as far as relevant context, you get that from the introduction of that same, like I said, so much of this test is right out of the argumentative assignments. Okay. So we talked about population boom and dispersal. And so hence the British administration after 1763, when they won the French and Indian War and gained control over North America against France in particular and Spain, that they felt a need to reapply a better colonial grip over us at that time, right? This is connected to the salutary neglect thesis, right? That they tried to crack down on us after neglecting us for a while at the end of the French and Indian War. So population boom was experienced, urbanization and people moving from the cities into the frontier regions. So a sense of of expediency, like they need to better administer the colonies because all the problems that come with urbanization, crime, garbage disposal, housing, uh, employment and unemployment, etc. Right, and then also with the frontier concern that we were going to fight with the Native Americans, because remember, as you see there in the number on option C, I would take a good look at that as far as its veracity, how true that may or may not be, right? Is that they were not very accommodating, the Whig Party nor the Tory Party of Parliament, nor George III of England at the end of the French and Indian War to grant Western land to the colonists, because they felt like we were largely to blame for the French and Indian War erupting to begin with, and that they were trying to finally come to peaceful terms with the Native Americans. And so they were not wanting to encourage American colonists, Euro Americans, white Americans, non Native Americans to squat on Native American lands. As you may recall, the Proclamation of 1763 forbade it and said that it was illegal and prohibited to do so. All right, so population changes, political ambiguity regarding the status of white colonial men. I mentioned that in a previous lecture, and it's also mentioned in the introduction. Those are all usually considered as relevant context to the War for Independence. Um, and then big historical events like the 7 Years' War, etc. Those were all mentioned, but certainly not a policy of wanting to placate Americans and grant them Western Native American lands. One can make the argument that it was just the opposite. Okay, so hint, hint there. So then, with the ones on the textbook, the few that I have, I'm going to let you look into that yourselves. So Alan Brinkley, does he adhere to Howard Zinn's very cynical thesis of these elitist founding fathers, kind of serving as demagogues or manipulators of the common people? You know, take a look at that in the book, but you could probably guess that's not very likely, because most of the time textbooks, in order to be chosen as a textbook, oftentimes you don't want to take too great of risks in historiography and the art and science of your historical approach to topics. You don't want to be too radical in your thesis. So, so that's something to consider. But take a look at that for number 9. All right. And then numbers 10 and 11 refer to numbers 1 and 2 in the Articles of Confederation assignment, the one called Drifting Toward a Republic, when we tried a confederation at first. So remember, right, the type of governments in at the state levels, also number 12 we're dealing with, all 3 of them. They did tend to be rather enlightened, rather liberal in the classical liberal sense of libertarianism, little government involvement in people's lives, maximize the amount of personal liberty, maximize the degree of democratic government at the state levels, minimize the power of the central government and give state level governments optimal powers, right? They were certainly not conservative. During the War for Independence, a lot of Enlightenment, literally quotes and terms like natural rights and social contract and popular sovereignty were etched into the new state constitutions as the assemblies have been kicked out by their governors and were existing during the War for Independence extra legally out on the side and not recognized by Britain. Remember, right, the thesis I made, the argument in a previous lecture, that it's a bit boring because I love argumentative historiographical debates, right, of various interpretations going at it with one another. In this case, right, in the topic of the Articles of Confederation, it's a bit boring because it's a bit monolithic. It's almost always the same classical interpretation that I come across in book after book. And that was, right, is that events played into the hands of the conservatives. The conservatives had, as well as the liberals for that matter, who were well read and had their classical education, were warned that too democratic of government leads to chaos and demagogue rule, right? That people will be rashly led by their selfish ambitions, by their emotions, right? And won't make wise, rational, logically long-term, wise decisions. and that a decentralized confederation will turn into chaos, that states will vie with one another commercially, over territory, over currency policies, etc. And it seems that those negative stereotypes about too much democracy and about too decentralized a government, that's exactly what happened, what played out in the popular narrative. That the people in the states, when we tried a confederation, they played right into the hands of the conservatives by acting self-destructively and chaotically, etc. And hence that even the liberal libertarians like Jefferson and Patrick Henry, that it kind of quieted them and it limited how much they fought against this new constitution that would be created. And as you saw in the Constitution assignment, right, this Constitution, in contrast to this Democratic Confederation, was much less democratic and much more centralized, right? And so then with number 11, remember Pauline's thesis, that's straight from number 2 on that assignment. And she does contend, right, in cynical fashion, that the founding fathers were a bit stingy in giving out liberal and enlightened components to this Constitution when they met in Philadelphia of 1787, that they almost had to be forced, that they almost needed this public pressure put upon them, right, to institute the Bill of Rights, right, where our natural rights are enumerated down on the Constitution, and other elements to it for forbidding a nobility, demanding that the Constitution be the law, the ultimate law of the land, and the arbiter deciding what the government leaders can and cannot do, demanding the right of habeas corpus if you're accused of a crime, except of course, in the case of a rebellion. So a lot of the enlightened components that you have in the Constitution, Pauline Maier says the founding fathers initially weren't even going to put those in. But what happened, right, is when they left Philadelphia that summer of 1787, they needed 9 of the 13 states to ratify or approve it. And many people in those states, especially in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, put up a big fight and made demands. They came in uninvited into the ratification conventions, for instance, and made demands and said, you're going to print this Constitution, allow the people to read it first. By the way, we're not going to approve of it in my city and locale until you put something in there for the rights of suspects when they're suspected or indicted for committing a crime, et cetera, et cetera. So that is true. The type of government that was devised, as you know, is a constitutional federal republic, constitutional that everyone and every body and individual has to adhere to the Constitution, because the Constitution was meant to be enlightened and classically liberal, and also, blind to distinctions and discrimination, right? That whatever's laid out is laid out and is meant to apply to all citizens, period. So there's an accountability level to that component to our government. The federal part, remember, is a combination of allowing elements of a confederation where you have state and local governments have some autonomy to do what they want and pass their own laws and have their own policies, but they have to share power, right, with a central or unitary government stationed in Washington, D.C. And then a republic, right, is known as a mixed government according to Aristotle and according to the Republic of Rome, right, where you had the elected tribunes, an element of representative democracy under Rome's republic, but then you had the Senate who were handpicked, and then you had 2 tribunes above them as presidents. And so we have a republic, right, and not a democracy, but a mixed government. Number 14, recall, okay, from the handout on great man history of the early republic, number 1, right, where it contends that the administration of George Washington, despite his best efforts, this is a common narrative anyway, is that despite Washington's best efforts to try to appear to be above the fray of partisanship between liberals and conservatives and act as if he was like a disinterested, benevolent father figure who was, tired of his 2 sons fighting with one another, etc. That despite his ability or his efforts to try to placate both sides, right? So we talked about him trying to be accessible to the people and go to goodwill tours and kiss babies and shake hands, have press conferences and show some accountability. His carrying out the State of the Union address and communicating with the legislator or Congress, right? His tolerance of hostile press, the Aurora, the National Gazette, those newspapers tore into him in his administration. A guy named Citizen Genet came on behalf of the French Revolution, went on a tour throughout the states without even meeting with Washington first, and tore into his administration, and even advocated somewhat treasonous rebellion amongst Americans against their Federalist administration. He put up with those things, right? He relinquished his sword at the end of the War for Independence to the Confederate government, and wanted to make it known that civilian power would be superior to military power, out of fear, obviously, in the Scottish Enlightenment of a military dictatorship, right? And so he gave those concessions, but to the conservatives, right? He gave a long leash to Alexander Hamilton, an uber conservative Secretary of the Treasury, who initiated a Bank of the United States when neither Article 1 nor Article 2 gives permission to the federal government to do such. And he utilized the very kind of controversial necessary and proper clause as his legal justification, which libertarians were frightened of to begin with, right? Whatever's necessary and proper at the end of that enumerated list in Article 1, Section 8, that it's arguably like a blank check, giving the government more latitude in the future to do more things. Remember, he wanted our republic to become commercialized with trade between regions to region and our country to other countries. And he wanted it to become financially sound, paying off our debts and having a good credit system, right, of lending and borrowing. He wanted it to become diversified and have as many different industries develop as possible, so that we can become economically self-sufficient and not be in need of the products and goods of Mother England and other countries. And he wanted us to have good infrastructure so populations could urbanize into big cities and connect one region to the other by transportation and trade, etc. And he didn't want to leave this to chance. He didn't want to leave it to the invisible hand of the market, as Adam Smith would write about in his Wealth and Poverty of Nations. So he was not laissez-faire, okay? From the get-go, from the first administration, it was not laissez-faire capitalism, okay? Let's see here. I want to look at the chat. See, do you guys have any questions? Let's see here. Okay, no problem, no problem. Thank you. I appreciate your concern for my son, and I understand those of you who need to go. I appreciate your communication. So let's see here. The Federalist Papers, remember, were 85, 87 short essays written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and John Jay, written right to try to philosophically, historically, mitigate the fears of the libertarians and the liberals about having this more centralized, less democratic republic that we devised in Philadelphia of 1787. And so they arguably, right, for one, we're not known, like in Europe, etc., right, as far as Western civilization. Americans to this day have a reputation for entrepreneurial success in business, right? For technological success with inventions and employing those inventions to good practical use, right? For relative, compared to other countries, economic equality of opportunity to realize the American dream, etc., right? Our pride and claiming that we're egalitarian and we're relatively democratic politically. We don't have much of a reputation, like Vienna, Austria, and Paris, France, and Munich, Germany. We don't have a great intellectual international reputation. And so the fact that they were engaging in philosophical inquiry, and getting into political science and philosophy, with human nature and trying to employ historical arguments to defend the type of government that we have. That's a little bit anomalous as far as our international reputation. And so we're proud of this as an intellectual work by our conservatives. And and we also contend, right, that with the manner by which 9 states did ratify this Constitution, that it was relatively, the Federalist Papers were relatively successful in kind of silencing or at least mitigating libertarian and liberal opposition. All right. Enlightened components to the Constitution, all right. Checks and balances, the Bill of Rights, the House of Reps are directly elected by citizens. Did we institute universal citizenship? No way, right? We take for granted now, by way of the 14th Amendment, that anyone born or naturalized in any of the states is guaranteed the rights, privileges, and protections of citizenship in all of the states. Well, guys, that's not until the end of the Civil War, right? With the 14th Amendment of 1868. So far from doing that, the founding fathers, they kind of chickened out, if you will. They did not adhere to the Enlightenment concept of universal citizenship for all human beings. They allowed citizenship to be decided by each state. Okay. Conservative elements to the Constitution, 17. Senators do have longer terms and were not initially elected directly by citizens of their states. Article 1, Section 8 gave a long list of enumerated powers to the Central Congress as opposed to the states, like in the Confederation, and ended with the necessary and proper clause at the end, kind of giving them an added blank check, if you will. Implicitly, you'll find evidence for slavery. They can't even touch the slave trade issue until 1808. They put a gag rule on it. There's a fugitive slave law whereby slaves have to be returned to their masters and states. Absolutely conservative component to the Constitution, right? Minutes of congressional meetings being published from time to time. Yes, you find that in Article 1, but would you call that conservative? I subjectively would not, because that's in the name of transparency, of the politicians having to, open up and convey to their people where they stand on issues, what they're mentioning, and what they're voting yay or nay on, etc. So notice on number 17, you're not looking for one that is false or not found in the Constitution. You're looking for one that is not conservative as opposed to the others. So clearly I intended that one as the one that was wrong. With the conservatives on number 18 is, remember, I made the argument in the lecture as well as the argumentative assignment, but especially the lecture, that our ideological divide between the left and the right, left wanting radical change from early modern history, medieval history, and the right wanting to adhere and conserve as much of tradition as possible, right? I made the argument subjectively, okay, that the American political spectrum was not that broad, and that arguably has benefits and costs to it. But to me, there's, compared to other countries, you didn't see that big of a gulf between the left and the right. So, for instance, those on the left, they didn't want a direct democracy. They didn't even want purely a representative democracy. They still, Jefferson included, wanted unelected officials to share power and have checks and balances with elected officials, right? That they weren't that far to the left. They didn't push for universal citizenship. They didn't push to abolish slavery. They didn't push for women's rights. Okay, and so they didn't push for limitations on how much property or wealth you could acquire. Uh, and then you look at our right still wanted elected representatives to share power with unelected or appointed representatives. They still wanted a written constitution that made clear what the government leaders could and could not do, right? And systems of checks and balances, etc. So the conservatives were not that far to the right. They still wanted a balanced republic, but they were elitist about who ought to be elected and appointed in that republic, right? And remember, I made the modern, perhaps not so effective analogy of saying, right, rhetorically, do you believe that everyone in this country, everyone in the world for that matter, all human beings for that matter, ought to be entitled to the same rights, privileges, protections, right, under law? And of course, the answer should be yes, right, under today's value system. But do you believe, however, that everyone is equally capable of writing a good English paper for you or fixing your car? And of course, rhetorically, right, the answer is meant to be no on the second question, is that they just felt like they wanted to make sure that the better sort, right, was chosen, who had the leisure, who had the education, who had the intelligence, right, by nature and nurture, to better rule more wisely, right? But they still wanted them to have limitations to their powers, restrictions on their powers, checks and balances, and accountability. They still wanted that. Okay. So let's see here. The anti-federalists were the libertarians, right? They were the libertarians. So they were afraid of an oligarchy more than they were of too much democracy or tyranny of the majority. They were afraid of a unitary government in Washington, D.C. more than they were of the chaos of the Confederation, etc. And so they constituted a large group, right? That the Federalist Papers were aimed for to try to mitigate their fears. Um, Hamilton, right? We've already talked about that with 20, how his actions with the US Bank and his system and so forth, right? And his response to the Whiskey Rebellion alarmed liberals and helped encourage the Democratic Republican oppositional party and the beginnings of a two-party system that you won't find in the Constitution itself, right? uh, that it was seemed to be excessively conservative, right, and inviting an oppositional party. So hence numbers 20 and 21 are a little bit redundant, but you find them therein. Um, Remember we talked about how George Washington did his best to try to balance the left and right, right? Hence, like when you see with a number 23, and also with 22, but yet by the end of his administration, right, the fact that he tried to unilaterally declare neutrality when Article 2 does not say the president has the right to declare neutrality when an international war erupts, his conservative response to the Whiskey Rebellion and sending a large army against it, right? He claimed executive privilege. Jay's Treaty was very excessively lenient toward Great Britain. All those are true, and that by the end of his second term, it seemed to be more openly suspected by the American population that he was not this indifferent father over partisanship and civic minded man who was looking at the whole country and not just one party or platform. But by the end of his second term, his popularity had somewhat diminished, and that he was seen as being a conservative, right? McCullough, number 24, adheres to what was it, number 2 on the Great Man Early Republic handout. And remember, it's court history where he declares, right, that John Adams was too honest for his own good. He was too independent minded for his own good and ended up alienating himself from both his own conservative Federalist Party and the liberal Democratic Republican Party, right? So remember, the Alien and Sedition Acts were definitely described as constitutionally dubious and controversial, right? It gave the president power to deport illegal immigrants from France, particularly radical immigrants, right, during the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution. So not the opposite. It didn't give Congress that power. Congress gave it to him, and that was controversial because powers over immigration and naturalization are given to Congress, not the president in the original Constitution. So are they giving a constitutional right given to them by the founding fathers? Are they handing it over to the president? And of course, that upsets checks and balances that are intended to prevent tyranny from any single group or department, right? So that was concerning to liberals, right, who were afraid of tyranny from the president. It also definitely it curtailed, it cut short, right, First Amendment rights, so that if you had reason to know what you were printing was false and engaging in libel against the government, that you could be held accountable, punished, fined, even arrested uh, in the midst of your freedom of expression. And to this day, we have certain limitations, right? But nothing that extreme. We have the clear and present danger clause, right? So you can't yell bomb on an airplane or fire in a theater, etc., right? But not arguably not of that nature. Um, Hofstadter, this is the mommy and daddy thesis. Number 26 refers to number 3, I believe it is, on the handout. Once again, so much of this is right out of these argumentative assignments. So remember his thesis that he had a rich and very self-entitled mother and her mother's parents, married a commoner dad. He never felt like he got his dad's approval, and that he felt angry toward the arrogance and the sense uh, what's the word I'm thinking of? Where everything is owed to you, right? Shame on me. I can't believe the word's not coming to me right now. But that sense, right? Uh, he resented that, and so was there a degree of wealth guilt, a degree to which he was trying to win over his dad, his commoner dad's approval, a degree to which he was passively, aggressively fighting against what he resented in his mother's family, and him trying to convey himself as a man of the common people. Because in reality, right, when you look at his upbringing, Jefferson was anything but a common kid socioeconomically. All right. Um, then you look at Thomas Jefferson, and remember, with him and with Woodrow Wilson, just a few presidents, perhaps William McKinley. He's one of the few presidents where people try to address apparent paradox or contradictions or hypocrisy between what he contended that he believed in prior to becoming president, and then what he actually did and didn't do when he became president. So remember, he comes in and he developed a reputation in his writings, right, with a French friend that became published, supposedly unbeknownst to him, known as the Virginia Letters or Letters from Virginia, right, whereby he makes some bold claims, right, in the name of liberty, in the name of the sagacity and wisdom of the common man, in the name of libertarianism, that government cannot and should not ever do anything that is not expressly given it permission to do in a written constitution. But then he becomes president, right? He allows Hamilton's system, his economic system and Bank of the US with its subsidies and involvement in the economy to survive, and contends, right, that it has loans to too many businesses and industries, and that it would just be too harmful of a domino effect to kill that system. So he grudgingly allows it to persist. He contends, right, that there's no use in trying to fight slavery, that it's too deeply entrenched in the South. The people his generation are not ready to let go of their slaves. And so, hence, his own slaves are better off under his care because he is so allegedly benevolent to them, etc. Right, etc. So he can't take that issue on. He contends that nothing is more emblematic of a the unhealthiness of slavery than sexual relations between a master and a black woman slave. And he has an affair, a long life, a long-term affair with Sally Hemings, and has 4 children grow up to adulthood with her. Um, and so, it's just one contradiction after another. The second article in the Constitution does not declare that he could send a man on a foreign mission to overthrow a foreign leader, like he sent William Eaton to overthrow Yusuf Karamanli of Tripoli, right, in North Africa, with his Barbary corsairs that were extorting American merchants in the Mediterranean Sea. But he did so anyway, right? He sent the USS Philadelphia to punish these Barbary Coast pirates without congressionally Congress first raising the Navy and the Army and giving their express permission by a declaration of war or something tantamount to that, and then allowing him as commander in chief to send boys over to fight. That was ironic that he engaged in the Barbary Coast or Tripolitan War without first getting congressional declaration for it. Um, he purchases the Louisiana territory. Nowhere in Article 2 does it say that the executive can purchase foreign lands, but he does so anyway, right? And says Napoleon is mercurial. He's like bipolar. He invaded Russia on a whim. What will he do with us? It's in our best interest, right? He justified the ends, right? Saying the ends justify the means. That it's best that we get rid of such a dangerous neighbor to our western borders. And also, right, he contends that he's going to open that land up to secure that the average subsistence farmer and small scale cash crop farmer has more land to squat upon and purchase and have available in future generations for the health of our republic, he contends, right? And then when he puts governments over that territory, you have Cajuns and Creoles from French Louisiana. You have Native Americans. You have Spaniards from when it was under Spain, and um, and you also have people in the military like Wilkerson and politicians like Aaron Burr, who at different times were trying to secede portions of that Western land from the rest of the country, even at times tinkered with the idea of selling it to a foreign country. And so, for all those reasons, right, he contends he cannot practice democracy, representative democracy, in this newly bought territory, right? But that they can't be trusted, and so hence he handpicks two segments, two boards, I believe anywhere from 12 to 21 handpicked men in sets of judges, etc., to rule over it until the territory reaches statehood status. Remember the Northwest ordinances, right? And they provide a systematic policy and procedure that's to be followed for a formal territory that's bought or conquered by the government to be eventually incorporated as a state. And so he did not practice his democratic, inclination in the Louisiana territory. And when he sent Lewis and Clark, I know this is bordering on, a gross simplification, but Meriwether Lewis brought back a lot of information that tended to dovetail with Jefferson's intellectual curiosity. Stuff about the animal and plant life, the geography, the soil composition, the weather, etc. Right? That just made sense, right? As far as a topography expedition, this Lewis and Clark expedition, to just simply try to discover, to find out what is this territory like that he is in the process of purchasing from Napoleon, right? But arguably Clark, when you look at Clark's diary, his MO in interacting with Native American tribes, it looks more like a pre-conquest military spying expedition, whereby he gives numbers of tribes. He gives inclination to the president as to who can be bought with certain commodities and what their price might be, right, to win them over. And as far as who might need to be fought and how much force needs to be employed to militarily defeat these Native Americans. And of course, remember, he literally would greet some of them at times by stating, "Greetings from your great white father," which was President Jefferson. So you have imperialistic designs that seem to be inherent in the Lewis and Clark expedition and others like Zebulon Pike and others who were sent on like-minded expeditions. All right. Look at the textbook for 28. All right. Let's see here. We already talked about 29, right? Before declaration of war. Yes. Number 30, that sadly is true. Despite his adherence to the Enlightenment in his early writings, right? Remember, the Enlightenment was about the inherent equality of human beings, not just in the entitlements to their rights, but in their basic capacity as human beings. And that it largely, a lot of its writers contended that differences, right, and certain countries, for instance, reaching a higher level of civilization according to their own standards or measuring stick for what civilization constitutes, right? That the differences are largely circumstantial, historical, environmental, and not innate, not biological, right? But Thomas Jefferson in his writings, especially as he got older, conveyed the concern that he was scared to death of freeing the slaves, largely because of his fear of miscegenation, of interethnic sex and procreation. He was so afraid of white blood being, quote, diluted by black blood, because he believed that black African people were innately, biologically inferior in intelligence and culture creating capacity, in self-control, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously that's a big stain on his legacy, right? And irony again with his love affair of Sally Hemings and raising up or rearing 4 kids with her biracially. So let's see here. Number 31, look at Brinkley's book if you would. All right. Number 32, as you see there, right? Uh, the reasons there are correct, right? Violations of our international rights on the high seas. Remember impressment. Remember fomenting rebellion amongst our Native Americans at Tippecanoe, and your video of recent note on the War of 1812. But was it the French? No, of course it was the British, right? So I just switched that up. So be mindful of that. Um, Number 33, the video is pretty clear on that. The Canadian civilians did not embrace us en masse, right, as a collective entity. The Canadian invasions, the 3 major ones, were a fiasco and a failure, right? Let's see here. 34 is pretty clear on the truthfulness of that claim of 34, right? That a lot of red sticks chose the British because they were tired of American squatters coming in upon their land. Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, Alabama, the Ohio Valley by the Great Lakes. There was a lot of American pioneer infiltration into those lands, and the Native Americans resented it, and the British very shrewdly capitalized on that and promised them that if they fought with them, the British, that they would secure their territorial integrity and keep Americans off their lands. Euro Americans, that is, right? United States Americans, not Native Americans. And then, according to the video, was the fighting in the South, was it less intense? No, you can make the argument it was more intense. Look at Fort Mims massacre. Look at Horseshoe Bend. Look at the invasion of Pensacola, Florida. It was pretty fierce, the fighting with the Red Sticks down in the South. All right. So are there any questions? We technically have gone through the test.
I have one question.
Yes.
Okay. I know you said for 28 that it's in the book, but I was trying to still figure that out.
Sure. Let's take a look.
I guess it's just my head not thinking.
It's okay. And you're a good student. I give you the benefit of the doubt that you have, looked into that already. According to the textbook, President Thomas Jefferson was surprisingly bipartisan in his appointments, wanting to surround himself with divergent views in line with the principles of intellectual freedom, discourse, and synergy. Again, this is another element of hypocrisy, right? Of apparent hypocrisy and irony with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was all about, he had some famous quotes earlier on stating, right, that there should be no limitations on the freedom of expression, and that in the political arena, there should be dialogue and even debate from all ideological perspectives, because he said truth need not fear falsehood. That when people's ideas come forth that are poor, that are illogical, that are even dangerous, that he had this belief again in like the collective wisdom of the common person, and especially of educated politicians, that while people might be tricked for a while, eventually they discern the truth, right? So that the truth need not fear falsehood, that there ought to be open discourse, and that the best ideas will prevail. They will be embraced by the leaders and by the people themselves. But when he became president, he was very notorious for only putting in people of his own party,
Okay.
other liberals in his administration. When people tried to get him, like Jefferson, right, and even John Adams, who was seen to be uber conservative, both of them put in some liberals into their cabinet and allowed, dialogue and discussion between liberal and conservative cabinet members in their cabinet meetings, at their dinner tables, etc. Supposedly Jefferson could not handle this. He the whole Hofstadter thing, right, of his psychological upbringing, that he was so uh, he was so non-confrontational and sensitive as a human being, that he didn't like debate. He didn't like to be around it. But that also, he just didn't practice what he preached. That when he came in, he had a liberal agenda, and he made no bones about it. He didn't want that agenda to be curtailed or fought at any level by his own doing. So he made it very clear he wanted a purely liberal administration. So yeah, so number 28 is false.
Thank you.
No problem.
I actually had another one.
Sure, it's okay.
Fine here. I have I guess I was just getting a little lost on 4 and 5. Um, I I think on 4 I put true, but no, I don't know why I'm trying to. I don't remember that as well. So
Well, let's see here. 4 and 5. What are we looking at? Um, the Enlightenment's notions of natural rights and the social contract regarding the source of a government's legitimacy and its proper role may have ideologically influenced America's propaganda campaign during the War for Independence. That was intended to be absolutely true.
okay,
And notice I played it safe by saying propaganda, so that it
okay,
hints that it how genuine it was, right? How genuinely the founding fathers and the leaders of the rebellion really adhered to and believed in it. That's argumentative, but they at
hmm,
least espoused it. They at least claimed it in their propaganda, right?
yeah,
And so, yeah, I think even if you don't adhere to Bernard Bailyn's romantic thesis that they genuinely adhered to it, I think the evidence is there that they at least used it, right, to try to garner support from the common American people to fight in the Continental Army and to join the cause of the rebellion, etc. And then the same thing with number 5. Lack of deference and obedience toward authoritative figures who had swayed from God's purpose and who had misruled is sometimes accredited to the spirit of 76 in the Declaration of Independence, and that was intended to be true as well. Again, that's focused upon in court history by Bernard Bailyn, as far as how influential it was in informing the beliefs of that generation of rebels. It's hard to gauge. But again, was it officially used in propaganda? Can you find it in leaflets and pamphlets and declarations made by Sons of Liberty chapters, right? Spoken of in the illegal assembly meetings and the committees of correspondence? Absolutely. You find plenty of quotes from the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, and from the religious Great Awakening.
thank you.
No problem. All right. So anyone else before we call it a day? I hope you guys are doing well. All right. Please be very deliberate in your answers, okay? Because, as a matter of course, it's certainly nothing punitive, but just kind of a philosophical decision on my part long before this semester is while, yes, it will, Andrea. Yeah, I will put this on Canvas as soon as my wife returns and technologically assist me in doing such. I'll be happy to later on this afternoon. No problem. All right. And so please remember that I've made the philosophical decision that while you have unlimited submissions on your first test, not so on your second and third. Okay. So you just get one stab at it. But remember, however, that you have what? About 13 assignments that are worth 50 points each. And then you have 3 tests. So you're literally, this is just 1 out of 16 assignments that's worth 50 points. So try not to sweat it too much, okay? Even if you don't do really well. In addition to that, I want to alleviate any anxiety over one submission circumstances for this test too. Also that I intend very soon to put up an option for extra credit to engage in an argumentative write-up from a list of different topics from which you can choose to write something. And it's completely extra credit, whatever you do, even if you do it poorly and get partial credit, that will add to your grade, right? Irina, great question. I don't want to make promises that I can't keep as far as giving you a finite number of assignments that I'll have done in a finite amount of time. But I promise you I will get to work on that. Okay. And so that you'll see an improvement on that. Okay. Sorry and thank you for your patience. And I understand what you're saying, right? As far as you're concerned, you want to make sure, as far as the score I give you, as far as the feedback that I give you, that you're on the right track. And you absolutely are entitled to that. You ought to be fully apprised of what my expectations are for you and being able to optimize how well you do in my class. So that's a very reasonable request. And I take it seriously and I apologize. And I assure you I will work on improving that, okay? All right, so if there aren't any other questions or comments, you guys, I'm gonna go ahead and let you go and call it a day. Later on this afternoon or early evening, this will be posted. And just please recall that you have one submission and you have till Sunday night to do it. And I wish you the best of luck, okay? Just go through this video as we have gone through the entire test. All right, so thank you. Okay, have a good week.
Thanks, Professor. See you later.
Thank you, Tristan. You as well. Have a good week. Thank you,
Thank
Amanda.
you.
Thank you.
Um,
Yes.
oh, it's just a personal thing. I just want to make sure if you could possibly post it today because I'm having surgery this week.
Oh, shoot.
I
Yes.
want to try to get it done before.
Sure. No, absolutely. So again, as soon as, no problem, Ryan. As soon as my wife gets home from work,
Okay,
I
great.
will ask her to, and I'm sure she'll accommodate. She will get on it immediately as soon as she gets home. I'm
All
sorry,
right.
I'm
Thank you
just
so
so
much.
lacking in technological savvy that I'm still in need of assistance in posting this stuff.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Good luck with your surgery, whatever that entails, Karen.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good week. Okay. And good luck.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.